Deltarune's Snowgrave route was probably one of the most surprising additions made to the game's second chapter, changing the outcome of the story quite radically and in a much more complicated and specific way than the genocide route in its predecessor Undertale. In comparison to the rest of the game, it's an incredibly dark, sinister and real experience that plays not just on wholesome RPG themes, but real-life psychological phenomena like dissociation, gaslighting, and self-delusion. The otherwise innocent, kind-hearted and skittish character Noelle is slowly and forcefully transformed into a very different person as she, with our guidance, loses touch with her previous self. Violent compulsions start to arise, and the entire context of the Dark World and progression of the story is changed quite radically, despite the supposed theme that in Deltarune, your choices don't matter. Now, there are a lot of interesting hints and details in this route, as well as items and events, which we can use to interpret both what the route means for Noelle and what implications it might have for the story of Deltarune as a whole. So, in this video, I want to explore what happens to Noelle in this route, as well as speculate a little bit on what these events might mean for her role throughout the rest of the game. For this video, I'm going to assume you're already familiar with the events of Deltarune chapters 1 and 2, and I'll only be summarizing the Snowgrave route itself, so please go play the game if you haven't already. And if you know the events of the Snowgrave route as well, please skip to this point in the video. Now, the Snowgrave route can be accessed if, when you encounter Noelle and she joins your party after trying to escape Queen, instead of progressing forwards, and in spite of Noelle's protests, you proceed backwards. When, after doing this, you encounter enemies in the game, Noelle has a new, suspicious spell: Ice Shock. To complete the route, this spell has to be used against every single enemy from now on, and it has the result of freezing them completely in place. This is already a very sharp contrast to the earlier parts of the game, because earlier it was actually impossible to kill or properly defeat any enemies. They'd always run away when their health went too low. Now though, after casting Ice Shock, each enemy stays permanently frozen in place, unmoving for the entire rest of the game. After a while of doing this, we encounter one of Chapter 2's merchant characters, the Addisons, and he offers to sell us some dating shoes. Instead of saying Chris and Noelle are friends, we must respond that they're, quote, something else. This prompts the shopkeeper to offer a freeze ring, but it always sells for exactly $1 more than whatever you happen to have. To continue, we must insist that Noelle get it, in spite of the lack of funds, until the screen eventually turns black and the soundbite for Ice Shock is heard. And we obtain the freeze ring, the implication of course being that Noelle froze the Addison in place. From here, we continue freezing all enemies encountered and insisting at every available opportunity that Noelle proceed. As we proceed, Noelle grows increasingly conflicted, and a subtle change in worldview seems to emerge. It's good to get stronger, isn't it? Eventually, we reach a dumpster where Spamton is clearly hiding, and similar to Undertale's genocide route, if we've frozen enough enemies, something new happens. In this case, Spamton is willing to sell us the Thorn Ring, a special item required to complete the route. Soon afterwards, we benefit from this when we encounter Birdley, as the ring reduces the TP requirement for the route's eponymous spell, Snowgrave, from 200%, which is impossible, to 100%. Noelle initially refuses to cast it on the grounds that she doesn't know the spell, but when she eventually gives in and casts it, Birdley is frozen in an enormous ice block, and Noelle, seemingly in a state of shock, walks off, saying she's going to go home. From here on out, the rest of the route is profoundly altered, with the Queen's mansion having been completely taken over by Spamton. Susie and Rolsey have done everything else in the route for us in the meantime, so similar to the genocide route in Undertale, we've essentially bypassed and missed out on the vast majority of the game. And finally, after defeating Spamton and returning to the light world, Birdley is suspiciously non-responsive. A key aspect of the Snowgrave route, which I think is an incredibly important reason why it's so disturbing, is that there are some distinct parallels between what happens to Noelle and several real-life examples of psychological abuse. It's no longer all fun and games like most of Deltarune. Instead, the playful atmosphere of the game gives way to themes that in many ways seem too real to be suitable for the game. Let's unpack this for a bit. One of the things that happen to Noelle throughout Snowgrave is that she gradually begins to lose her own sense of independence and agency, yet at the same time, an illusion is built up that she's actually gaining agency and autonomy. As a consequence of her trust in Chris, she does what they ask despite the direct and pushy tone they take on. For instance, when we ominously force Noelle to within inches of an electric barrier, she is forced to use Ice Shock to destroy it, but afterwards, she rationalizes Chris's controlling and almost life-threatening actions. I just listened to Chris's command, and somehow, before I knew it, the puzzle was finished. What was I thinking? Chris wasn't trying to hurt me. They were just making me stronger. The way she behaves and reacts to things is artificially altered against her will. She's forced to run past the mouse dispenser despite her discomfort and fear of mice, and she's forced to get the freeze ring, clearly not even aware of the fact that she had to kill the Addison to do so. The chilling thing about all this, though, is that all the while, Noelle herself believes she's making the choices herself, and she twists the nature of these events, no matter how wrong they are, into being something perfectly natural and positive. She's getting stronger. Isn't it a good thing? I'm solving things for myself, taking new things for myself, defeating enemies by myself. Although Chris doesn't directly gaslight Noelle, there's an ominous similarity between what happens to her throughout the route and the very much real phenomenon of gaslighting. Gaslighting, as I'm sure most people know at this point, is where an abuser uses various techniques to sow confusion and self-doubt in a victim as to the nature of some abuse that's occurred, or even the reality of concrete events. It's a common and very real phenomenon in abusive relationships, and I'm certain many people can relate to the kind of doubt and loss of connection with one's own sense of reality that goes along with it. In Snowgrave, Noelle gradually loses touch with herself, all the while believing that she's actually going through a transformation for the better, that she's gaining autonomy over her actions and getting stronger. An extra element of disturbingness is added to all of this when you consider that Chris and Noelle have been friends for such a long time. Noelle trusts Chris and is more prone to doubt her own judgment than to blame Chris for their actions. Chris wasn't trying to hurt me, they were just making me stronger. This adds the extra element of trust abuse. Even though it isn't technically Chris, but rather the player who is responsible for what happens, because of this relationship between them, the events of the route nonetheless become all the more dark, since they amount to an abuse of trust in order to manipulate Noelle and twist her sense of reality completely. The most psychologically damaging kinds of abuse are always those which occur between people in a close relationship. You aren't going to allow a complete stranger to gaslight you so badly that you completely dissociate, but if it's a trusted friend or family member, well, things quickly get more complicated. On the topic of dissociation, another theme in the route seems to be namely that. We see many examples where Noelle is apparently unaware of what is actually happening. For instance, after she freezes the Addison, she doesn't understand how they managed to get the ring, assuming that the Addison must have given it to them. And when she casts Snowgrave on Birdley, she completely dissociates from the situation and walks off, not to be seen again until the very end of the game. In connection with this, I think the motif of snow, ice, and cold is quite significant. Noelle is, in reality, a pretty warm-hearted person. Although she's nervous around Susie owing to her crush, she generally seems to be kind and positive, and clearly has a trusting and empathetic personality. It's therefore quite noteworthy how this emotional character gets contradicted throughout the Snowgrave route. Because what happens to Noelle during Snowgrave? She essentially loses touch with herself. She gradually begins to doubt her actions, and the warmth we previously observed slowly disappears. Symbolically, I think the motif of the cold throughout the route therefore becomes an expression of Noelle gradually losing touch with who she actually is. It becomes a symbol for the fact that she's gradually dissociating from reality. She isn't just freezing others, but in the process, she's also being frozen on the inside, herself. The most striking example of dissociation is what we see after Noelle freezes Birdley using the Snowgrave spell, completely losing touch with reality as she walks off. There was so much snow, I couldn't see anything. In other words, the dissociation and self-detachment was so strong that she could no longer see or recognize what she was doing. Before moving on though, there is some more interesting symbolism as well. For example, the presence of the freeze ring and thorn ring sort of point to the idea of bondage, especially the thorn ring, like she's being bound to Chris or whatever is acting through them, especially with the thorn ring, which apparently makes the wearer take damage from pain and induces the trance effect. The damage from pain could be connected with the dissociation. Because Noelle isn't mentally acknowledging the wrongness of what we're making her do, she instead suffers physical symptoms, taking literal damage from the pain. In other words, she may pretend that everything's normal, but her body knows that it's not. And given the psychological context I've already discussed, this trance effect becomes all the more ominous as well. When we first encounter Birdley, she says, "Looks like it's another enemy. Should I freeze them?" She no longer even looks up to check who it is. She's become completely entranced, and the trance in question is a dissociative trance, representing how Noelle has, again, totally lost touch with the implications of what she's doing. Now, like I said, the Snowgrave route also has some interesting implications as to what Noelle's role might be in later installments of Deltarune. See, a really interesting detail during the route is that Noelle is repeatedly referred to as Angel. The first time this occurs is when speaking to the Addison. When Noelle at first refuses the prospect of buying the freeze ring, he says, "Come on, Angel, you can't get stronger without good equipment." And later, when we meet Spampton to buy the thorn ring, he says,
Angel, are you looking for the ring of thorns?"
Noelle is repeatedly referred to as Angel. Now, where have we heard that before? A human, a monster, and a prince from the dark. Only they can seal the fountains and banish the angels' heaven. I'm not the only one who has noticed this correlation between Noelle and angels, though. In fact, I found an interesting Reddit thread while researching for this video, which points to a lot of conspicuous details on this topic. While on the Ferris wheel, Noelle mentions how she'd jump out the window and grow big angel wings. There's also an angel doll in Rudy's hospital room, which Noelle and her missing sister Des apparently made in a youth group. And finally, if we have a look at the eponymous Deltarune of the game, we see 4 main sub-symbols. 3 triangles, one of which points downwards and 2 upwards. The ones pointing upwards clearly represent the 2 Lightners from the legend, and the last one represents the Prince from the Dark, namely Rolsay. The circle then must represent the angel mentioned in the prophecy, and as the Reddit post points out, there is a conspicuous similarity between the wings of this angel and antlers. So what does this mean? Well, clearly there is some evidence connecting Noelle with the idea of angels, and The only other reference we have to angels is the angel from the prophecy, who is involved in causing the roaring and is also a possible final boss for Deltarune as a whole. In addition to angel imagery specifically, though, there are also very notable connections between Noelle and Christ. Most obviously her name, but also, the fact that she's essentially crucified by Queen at the end of the normal route. With details like this in mind, connecting Noelle with angels and general religious imagery, it's quite reasonable to assume she has something to do with the angel in the prophecy. Perhaps the Snowgrave route might just be the initial beginnings of a transformation which will happen to Noelle, eventually culminating in her becoming the angel from the prophecy of the Deltarune. Given the game's emphasis on the fact that you're not in control, that your choices don't matter, it may be the case that the consequences of the Snowgrave route, namely Noelle's transformation from a kind-hearted girl into a confused and dissociated ice cube, might, one way or another, be an unavoidable part of the story. If that's so, then Snowgrave might just be a way to accelerate this process, giving us a hint and warning of the dark potential contained within her, destined to boil to the surface during later installments and culminating in her role as the distorted prophet of the roaring itself. In any case, I think we would be naive to assume that the things we learn in the Snowgrave route have no important implications as to the future of the game. Either way, Snowgrave is an eerie presentation of real-world phenomena like psychological abuse and dissociation, which I think, while appearing somewhat out of place when compared with other aspects of Deltarune, was nonetheless very well pulled off, and I'm excited to see where Toby Fox takes it next whenever the next chapters drop. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. And by the way, if you enjoyed this video and content like this in general, I highly recommend that you check out my new Substack. On there, I'll mostly be posting stuff themed around symbolism and philosophy in games and other media similar to the channel, so if you like this type of stuff, go have a look. And also let me know in the comments if there are any other topics from Undertale or Deltarune that you'd like me to cover. And I'll see you next time.